All right. Hello and welcome, everybody. Today I'm joined by Adem Kassie. Adem is Vice President of the African Network of Constitutional Lawyers and is a regular commentator on Ethiopian politics. And he had joined me today to talk about what is happening in Ethiopia. He has been writing opinion pieces about what's happening in the Amhara region. So we'll cover those aspects of Ethiopian politics. So welcome, Adem.
Thank you very much, Thekla. It's a pleasure to join you again.
It's my pleasure. This is second time joining, although the first one was for a different channel, but still it was a conversation that I thoroughly enjoyed, and a lot of people have told me that they enjoyed it as well, and I hope this one is going to be as enjoyable for our listeners.
I hope so too. I hope so too.
All right. So why don't we, Adem, start with you telling us a little bit about yourself for some of my listeners who might not have heard about you. I think it would be good if you told us what you do, what you have studied, where you are now, how you are connected to Ethiopia, and all that.
Yeah. Well, no. So my name is Adem, as Thekla introduced me. I grew up and studied and worked in Ethiopia. And I grew up in a small village quite close to Bahar Dar, studied there and moved to Juma University. That's where I studied for my university and worked a little bit in Haramaya, Harar, and Dredawa, and then moved to South Africa, where I completed my studies in democratization and human rights, and then subsequently completed my PhD around comparative constitutional issues. I have since then basically been working around those themes. I find that most of the troubles that our political entities, including Ethiopia, face are connected with the way the political system, the way the institutional system is designed. And so I find it interesting often to look at whenever there is a problem, looking at how it is connected to the design of the institution, the system. So I've been working around that, and at the moment, I am working as part of an organization called International IDEA, where we support transitions from peace, from conflict and authoritarianism towards peace and towards a relatively democratic dispensation. And increasingly, we're also working around issues of consolidation of democracy, preventing backsliding, and all of that. Obviously, because I'm Ethiopian, I write and think about what is happening in Ethiopia quite a bit. And I'm actually affiliated with institutions in Ethiopia as well. But my portfolio at International IDEA is the world. I have to work across the world. Which is very useful in the sense that you get exposed to ideas, ways of thinking, and institutional arrangements that may look unfamiliar, but are designed to solve some of the problems that we face in Ethiopia. And in that regard, I also work as part of what is called the African Network of Constitutional Lawyers. It's an organization. It's based in South Africa, but we have members across the continent. And we work around ways of promoting democratic constitutionalism, also looking at what the African Union, sub-regional organizations, and other entities can do. So in short, I am fascinated by problems that emanate from contestations around the design of the system, around the design of the institutions. And I try to look at the issues we face in Ethiopia from based on that framing.
Oh, that's wonderful. And presumably the Ethiopian constitution is also something that you think about a lot. And
that's right. That's right. I'm actually at the moment editing a book on the Ethiopian constitution with a few colleagues. Unfortunately, it has taken a lot longer than we thought, but hopefully it will come out this year. And I've written quite a bit on the Ethiopian constitution, both in academic journals, but also in commentaries. And so it is indeed an institution, and I consider it an institution that I have written and think about a lot.
Well, I hope after your book has been published, you will come on and we will discuss about that as well. But I think that would be good for us, for my listeners, for people to discuss and to debate the Ethiopian constitution. I think that is something that doesn't happen as often as I would like. People have very sweeping opinions about the constitution. But when you ask them exactly what it is that they have problems with, or what it is that they have issues with, they generally struggle to spell them out. And I think there's generally that problem in Ethiopia, a problem of not really properly study the object that you are talking about. So that's for another time, and I hope that will happen. But I think now we're going to go directly into current events in Ethiopia. And as I felt compelled to invite you on, actually, after I read the article that you co-wrote from Foreign Policy, I think, where you detail what is happening in the Amhara region in terms of the fight between the Fano paramilitary militia group and the Ethiopian federal government. So why don't you give us a summary of what, it's been a month now since you published that article, but I think the main sort of the fundamentals remain the same. So tell us what is happening there.
Well, so I think basically, I have actually been trying to avoid writing about the issue, partly because it's personal. And it's often difficult to be neutral. And so I've been taking my time to think about what the issues were. But also, I think it has been depressing on two levels. First is that the conflict, which is now in its 8-9 months, I think, has been causing tremendous suffering. And as always, with the longer the conflict takes, especially the army starts to be frustrated, and they start to see the community, the host of the rebellion, as complicit in the fight, and there is a tendency, or at least a willingness, to engage in collective punishment. And so we've been hearing a lot about atrocities committed in different parts of the region, but also at the broader humanitarian level. According to the recent report, more than 2.6 million children have been pushed out of school, so they are not going to school. And I can say that because my family members as well have not been going to school in my village, in the town where I grew up. And so the farming, the seeds and fertilizers have not been readily available, and so the production has gone down. And so that the overall humanitarian situation has been really bad. But increasingly, on top of that, there has been atrocities committed, according to reports mainly attributed to the Ethiopian army, and the militia fighting alongside it. So it's depressing from that perspective. But also, I think it's depressing, even more depressing on a second level, which is that the authorities either don't see it as a big problem, or they think it's something that will just go away. And so the absence of political will to give it the attention that it deserves is even more depressing. So I started thinking and writing that article basically as a way of putting out there what I think are some of the fundamental issues in the region, but also nationwide, and what could be done to avert some of the dangers that I see are coming. And unfortunately, all I see at the moment is things getting really worse. As I said, education, transportation has been disrupted, and that means health systems, the structure has effectively collapsed. The agricultural production, farmers are struggling, but it's particularly people in urban areas. They also struggle with access to basic needs and all. And so, essentially, what I'm trying to do is put it, out there, hopefully give it the attention that it deserves, and drive some kind of momentum towards identifying solution to the problems that have been engulfing the region.
You're saying that, Adam, in the piece, that the reason that the Fano members were forced to pick up arms is because there is a feeling of alienation in the Amhara region, historical alienation, not just now, and they feel that Abiy is trying to perpetuate that sense of blaming ethnic Amharas for all sorts of problems, discriminating against ethnic Amharas in Oromia region and Tigray and other areas, but generally a feeling of sort of grievances against the regime. What is that sense of? What is that source of grievance? Would you say?
Yeah. Well, so you're right. I think we can look at it at different levels. The first one is at the level of narrative, and you touched on it. I think the Amhara people in general have felt that the foundation, of the political system, the post-1990 political system, is rooted in an anti-Amhara narrative, right? Around an idea that there was a group called an Amhara that was dominant, that was oppressive, and that the whole political system is a response to that. And so there is a rejection of that idea. That a lot of Amharas think that even if the former governments spoke their language, even if the former government promoted their culture at an individual and at a regional level, they were victims, just like everybody else. So they don't want to be accused of No, sorry about that.
That's all right.
But they feel like they were victims just like everybody else. And that they realize that just because a government speaks your language, it doesn't mean that they'll be nice to you. So I think there is that sense that they are blamed unfairly. That's one. That's a narrative level. And secondly, I think at an idea level as well, that what is called Amhara today, at least in the things have been shifting in the past few years, but the general tendency was to promote the idea of Ethiopianness, that Ethiopia belongs to everybody, that we need to we need to be able to move freely across the country, and they think the current political dispensation creates a sense of ownership at the regional level. And so essentially every place has an owner, that they then have some kind of power to exclude others, right? And that's what, the sense of ownership, whether that was the intention of the political system or not, it has created a situation where some groups feel that they own some place, and that because they own it, that they have a privileged position in those areas. And because of historical reasons, as you may know, the people of Amhara origin have moved across the country. And that means that millions of Amharas living outside of what is now considered as their home region feel like they are not represented, that they don't belong there. So politically, they are marginalized, they are not represented. And because of that lack of political representation, political marginalization, they feel insecure, right? And so you have the narrative, and you also have a rejection of the idea. And the third one is the consequence of this combination. The combination of an idea that they resent, and a narrative that puts them as oppressors, has led to consequences of displacement, of killings, and other initiatives. Sometimes, often they are buttressed by authorities, or at least are tolerated by authorities. And so the narrative and the ideas have led to consequences for a lot of Amharas, particularly for those who happen to be outside of their region. But also for Amharas living in the region, there was a sense that that because they are seen as beneficiaries of past regimes, they are not given a fair advantage or a fair representation or an equitable access to resources at the national level. So there's that tendency. And in fact, in some of my conversations, it's very interesting to see, but in some of my conversations, they say that the Amharas have been told that they are oppressors, that they don't even dream of being a prime minister. Like Amharas, for a long time, will not even dream of being a prime minister because they see that then to be seen as the oppressors coming back to power and all. So there is that sense of oppression, right? That then undermines political ambition and all of that. And you have all of this, and unfortunately, the what is supposed to be the ruling party that represents the region has not been able to articulate these grievances, right? And so you have a ruling party, you have all these challenges, in terms of ideas, in terms of narrative, and in terms of consequences, but you have a ruling party that has not been able to sufficiently understand and sufficiently articulate these grievances, these concerns. And so what it has led to is that to a sense of lack of representation. So there's nobody that represents us. And that's what you see now, essentially. For me, what happened in August last year was really a trigger, right? The causes were already there. And quite frankly, I think when the war between the federal government and allies and Tigray started, that kind of disrupted a confrontation that was already coming, because the Amharas, initially they thought Abiy Ahmed, with his idea of Ethiopia-Net, with his idea that everybody belongs to the country, basically a recognition that there's such a thing as Ethiopian people. I think that's what, if you see the Ethiopian constitution and the political discourse, there are Amhara, there's Tigrayans, there's Oromos, but the framework had no place for Ethiopians. It has a place for Ethiopia and the different peoples, but it doesn't have a place for Ethiopians. And so when Abiy Ahmed came, there was a sense that, okay, at least in terms of ideas, we are being recognized. In terms of narrative, we're being recognized. But unfortunately, the consequence did not end. The victimization, the displacement and all did not end. And so there was a lot of disillusionment with Abiy. And the war in the north with Tigray started at that particular, when the disillusionment was essentially growing. And so in a way, it kind of patched it for a moment. It suspended that, what I think was an inevitable confrontation between a very, very angry Amhara community that feels victimized and a government that, at least initially, was willing to avert the narrative and the ideas, but was in practice either unable or unwilling to stop the consequence of that narrative. And so when, so in this context, then the sense of Amharaness was becoming very prominent. So this was it's quite new for Amharas. In the past, it was about Ethiopia and all, but because of the sense of victimhood, there is now an understanding that even if you are, you keep your idea of pan-Ethiopianism, you can only defend yourself as an Amhara first, right? And so that has become extremely prevalent. And that is now what is considered as Amhara nationalism, essentially. So Amharas are now thinking the central government does not represent us. The government in the region, which is supposed to represent us, does not do a fair job of representing us. And so we cannot let then institutions that could potentially protect us, like the special forces, like the Fano, the armed militias and all, we cannot let them be disbanded, because then we will be completely exposed. We have no representation politically. We have, and if we lose at least a sense of armed protection, and then that will then lead to insecurity, but also will lead to a situation where their demands will not be answered. And their demands, as I say, were evolving. First it was pan-Ethiopian, but now they were claiming their Amharaness. And that then comes because of the discourse that has been built into claims around territory as well. Right? And so the Amharas, if you look at the 1990s, where the land areas, where everything was arranged, there was really no Amhara constituency, right? There was really no organized Amhara constituency. And I don't know how much you know, but the ruling party that was governing Amhara at the time was an Ethiopian party. It just changed its name and became an Amhara party at that particular time. There were problems, but there was a sense that there was no one to articulate those problems. And initially, especially when Abiy Ahmed came to power, his narrative, his ideas, they really resonated with a lot of Amharas. But after a while, there was a realization that especially the victimization did not end, and there was also a realization that the part of the government that was supposed to be articulating these concerns, articulating these grievances, was not doing them. And so there was a sense that at that particular moment, Amharas had to organize as Amharas, and that's when when you become a group basically, and because the Ethiopian political architecture, whether that was the intention or not, has been designed around ownership, right? So if you are a people, you own a particular thing. And so the sense was Amharas did not negotiate those things in 1991, and so we have to negotiate them now. And that's why we see claims of, this belongs to me, that belongs to me, this is my area. All of that came now. Essentially, it arrived 30 years later, right? These conversations should have happened when the whole thing was built, and that could have avoided a lot of bloodshed and all of that that we see today. But overall, I think if I can summarize it with two things, you have grievances based on ideas, based on narratives, and consequences in terms of people being killed and all. Amharas living outside. Essentially, there's a sense of insecurity, a sense of marginalization, but also people, the region also feel there's a sense that the region is also not getting what is due to it, right, from the federal government in terms of federal subsidies, in terms of opportunities that come from the federal level. And there is a sense that no one is representing these things. And that's why there was now a reliance on Fano, a reliance on the region's militia to protect those interests, or at least to feel safe about it. And so when the government moved to disarm or disband, or as they say, demobilize the special force and disarm the Fano, it was just basically the last trigger. But for me, had the Tigray war not happened, the disillusionment and the sense of Amharaness that was emerging will likely have already led to a confrontation with the federal government, perhaps earlier than what we saw last year.
I think one issue here in terms of the sense of grievance and the sense of feeling marginalized, in the Amhara region. One issue is what part of it comes from objective reality, and what part of it comes from perceived reality that doesn't really exist. I just returned from Tigray, and everywhere you go in Tigray, people tell you that they had their relatives displaced from Amhara, for instance, from Gondar, and people even killed in Bahar Dar. And you know what happened in Western Tigray, and maybe you would say from places like Amhara and Wolkayt, the hundreds of thousands of Tigrayans who have been displaced by the Fano militia principally, and there is an objective sense of grievance in Tigray, and people will tell you in Tigray, actually, you're being ironic when you say that the Amharas have any reason. Again, the political discourse and not the ordinary people who have been displaced, whether that is from Tigray or from Oromia. I think they have objective reason to feel marginalized and discriminated against them. There is no issue there. But in terms of the political discourse, people will tell you actually the Amhara have no reason to feel victimized or marginalized when they have done the thing that I mentioned. So there's a sense of irony in what you say. That would be one of the reactions that you get. How would you reflect on that if I made the position clear?
Yeah, no, I understand. I think, as you say, the Amharas have a lot to answer to. I am from Marawi. I know before all of this started, already during the protests and all, before Abiy Ahmed came to power, a lot of Tagaru were displaced. I know it from as a fact, as a matter of fact. Um, and the war hasn't started, and I'm not talking about Western Tigray, Wolkai Tagari. I'm not talking about that area, the contested areas. I'm talking about ordinary Tigrayans that used to be living amidst everybody else, that were displaced, their properties burned and all that. So you're right about that. And then after the war started, in particular in the contested areas, a lot of Tagaru, as you said, but probably hundreds of thousands, were displaced, forcefully displaced out of those areas. So there is a sense of violence perpetrated by people of Amhara origin. And that's one. But that doesn't mean that they are not victims themselves. And I think that's one of the things that we don't understand, and not just between Tigrayans and Amharas, but also across the country. There is a sense that one group can only be a victim and another can only be a perpetrator. But in reality, and that's in a way that's a problem with groupthink, right? You can have people of Amhara origin, and I think there's no question about it. And for the last 30, 40 years, they have been displaced and killed, and in their millions in the past 30 years from across the country. So I think we should not deny that fact. And we even, I mean, I was just reading a few days ago that there was a problem in Wolaga, and a lot of people were killed, and apparently by the security forces. They don't indicate who, but often you have a sense of what has been happening. And so essentially what I'm trying to say is that, yes, the Amharas have to answer to for what was done to Tagarus, but the Tigrayans also have to answer to what happened before this, right? A lot of people of Amhara origin were, as you know, Colonel Demekas and all of that in the Wolkai Tagari area. Initially, the demand was really for recognition, like recognize us as Amharas, recognize our language. It was really for a recognition within Tigray, right? But over the years, a lot of people were displaced. I mean, I don't know, it's very difficult to put numbers, but one is already one too many. I'm sure you understand. And all of that creates grievances. And so, and I think what I urge myself and what I urge everybody else to do is think over a very long period of time. These are these are communities that have been together, that have lived as neighbors and as partners for a very long time. And so the sense of justice and the sense of injustice, the sense of violence is understood over a much longer period than we think, right? And so I think we have to have the wisdom and the courage to think, okay, one group can be simultaneously a victim and a perpetrator, and often that is the case, right? And in that sense, I think it's not fair to say that because the Amharas have been guilty of violence in the contested areas against Tagaru, that they have no reason to complain, because I think the Amharas have had a reason for a long period of time to feel that they were being displaced and they were being killed in the contested areas, but mainly in other parts of the country. As I said, because of historical reasons, the Amharas and Tagaru, by the way, have been all over the country. And that, the sense of ownership that has emerged then makes all of them vulnerable. And so that's one thing. And then secondly, I think, in terms of the narrative, the oppressors are seen as Amharas, right? And of course, as I said, Amharic was the language of the court, let's say, and Amhara culture. Although one would argue, for instance, in Wollo, that the Amhara, what you consider an Amhara culture, may be slightly different, right? And so it's very difficult to say this is an Amhara culture. But let's just, the Orthodox Christian, that it had a place in the court, in the political center. That Amharic was the language of administration, meant that Amharic speakers and people who are literate with Amharic had advantage. There's no question about that. But to then put everybody in the same box is seen as unfair for a lot of people, and especially for people. I'm sure. I remember, and I must confess this. I was in Mekelle in 2008, I think. So this was the time at the height of the so-called Tigray dominance, right? And you go there, you're driving out of Amhara region, you enter Tigray region, and there's really very little difference. Nothing. It's the same. People are there. You see people farming with one ox. You see poverty as much as you see in the Amhara region, right? And so it's just not fair to say that there was a Tigrayan dominance. There is an elite that benefits from a system, but to then extrapolate that into creating a narrative, which is very dangerous. It's a very dangerous thing, because the narrative there's no exceptions in narratives, unfortunately. And so there is that sense of that there's a violence of sorts through narrative that the Amharas consider. And so, but most importantly, I think, and I don't like comparing, but I say that the sense of lack of representation in Amhara is very powerful. So we have grievances, but there's nobody. At least in Tigray, you might hate the TPLF and all, but you can at least say, well, they speak for us, to an extent. And the Amhara region does not have it. And for instance, Oromia region didn't have it for a long time either, but increasingly with the emergence of now Oromia and the center, there's a better, at least there is a large part of Oromia that says they represent us, right? Even if there's still a large group that sees them as unrepresentative. So just again, to summarize, just like everywhere, if we think in groups, everybody is a victim and everybody is a perpetrator. I think we must recognize that. Like the fact that you are a perpetrator does not exclude that you are not a victim.
I think, Adam, it's good that you emphasize the point about the complex nature of things, that you could be a perpetrator and a victim at the same time. And I readily accept that. You're right. And to the extent that I implied otherwise, I have been mistaken. But I think the point that I'm trying to make, Adam, is that, so even it's a point that you make in that piece. You say that the reason why the Amhara Special Forces and the Fano found it difficult to disarm when Abiy apparently ordered them to demobilize and to disarm is because they were worried that the TPLF might invade. For instance, there is the sense that the TPLF might invade the Amhara region. And that is something that strikes me as odd. And I will strike anybody from Tigray as odd, because the TPLF has never said that it intends to invade. There has never been any that sort of political discourse in Tigray to either annex land by force, to expand. That is not a discourse that exists in Tigray. And when people say that the TPLF intends to invade Amhara, I think people in Tigray, including myself, find it very, very strange. And I think one of the reasons why people say that is because during the war with the federal government, because the TPLF forces, the Tigray forces, had advanced to the Amhara region. From Tigray's perspective, that was a necessary evil. They had no other way of fighting the federal government, because as soon as they ventured outside Tigrayan territory, they had to be in the Amhara or Afar region, because there was no other alternative. But at no point did they say, the Tigray forces say, that they intend to remain in Amhara or they intend to annex any land. So people find it strange and bizarre and even dishonest when some elites from the Amhara circles say that the TPLF might invade. So I think that is one of the points that I'm trying to make. Where did that worry, or maybe I would describe it as paranoid or paranoia, come from?
It's actually a good point, and I'm glad you have put the elephant. You brought out the elephant in the room. So there's two things. One is that I think in Tigray, the assumption is that there's no contestation, right? It's like Wolkite Agari belongs to Tigray, parts of Raya belong to Tigray. And so whenever Tigrayans think of Tigray, they think of the pre-2020 board boundaries, right? And so to that extent, for Tagaru, going back to those areas will not be seen as invading, right? But at the moment, for Amharas, for a lot of Amharas, they think these places are Amhara, right? But for the moderate ones, like myself, these places are at least contested, right? And so Amharas cannot claim it, but Tigrayans cannot claim it either. So they have to talk. And quite frankly, as I said, in the early 1990s, when the ethnic-based federal dispensation was taking shape, there was no genuine negotiation. Right? Also, it was partly because there was no power balance at the time. And as a result, it's not just between Amhara and Tigray, by the way, that there is a boundary contestation. As you know, Somalia and Afar regions have been fighting for very long. There are boundary disputes between Somalia and Oromia. There are boundary disputes between Amhara and Benishangul. There is boundary issues between Afar and Tigray. And so because those boundaries, the political ideology was essentially going towards a sense of ownership. So there were hard boundaries were important, but historically they didn't exist, right? So the sense of boundary, I don't know if you know the word in Amharic, it's called taraf, right? Not dimber. And taraf is a place, it's an open place, right? So there is no exact point. It's a place where you interact essentially with other communities. And so the point that I'm trying to make is that in Tigray, people do not think about invasion at all because they think that whatever was there before November 2020 was Tigray, right? But in Amhara, I said for a significant number of Amharas, it is Amhara for a significant, but for at least the moderate ones, it is contested. And what that means is that any attempt from Tigray, for instance, to take over these places by force would be seen as a sort of an invasion. So it's seen as a threat. And that's why I don't know if you've been reading, especially on the Raya front now, I hear, which is very disconcerting, that there is confrontations happening. And so in a way, before 2020, the Tigray region said, this is mine, I have it, you cannot talk to me. And in fact, you can't even think about an internal autonomy within Tigray. So that was the discourse. And then after November, a lot of Amhara staff say, this is mine now, you cannot take it. We have reclaimed what is ours. And so we cannot talk about it. So for me, it's very important to recognize, not just for Amhara and Tigray, but for all the boundaries, because they are really fluid. Because historically, there was no Oromia, there was no Amhara, there was no Afar. It didn't exist, in terms of a bounded region. And there was no negotiation, there was no talk in 1990 to say, okay, now that we're going to divide it based on ethnicity, and now that, and this is very important, now that these boundaries become really hard, right? And especially when you think of cessation, that whatever is yours, you can actually go with it. And that makes these boundaries extremely contested, extremely, there's a sense of win-lose, like zero sum. And so the boundaries became really, really important, but there was no negotiation to identify where those boundaries should lie. And of course, 30 years is a very long time. So whoever had it at that particular time had an advantage to kind of create a sense of belongingness, that it's mine. And whenever it's in your region, that also affects movement of people, right? So if it was, for instance, if the Walkai-Tagari was part of Amhara, I would suspect, there is no evidence, of course, it's very difficult to have counterfactuals, but if it was made part of Amhara at that particular time, I would suspect more Amharas would have moved there, right? Just like more Tigray and Tagaru moved there because it was part of Tigray. This conversation should have happened in 1990, but it didn't. And because it didn't happen, new realities start to emerge, which make it extremely complicated. The point I'm trying to make is that the fear in Amhara should not be seen based on the assumption, which is I think prevalent in Tigray, that these are ours, like these areas are ours. To the minimum, I think it's important to recognize that it's contested. And in terms of how this should be resolved, unfortunately, historically, between 1990 and 2020, Tigrayan, they were dominant center. So they said this is ours. And then after that, it's by force again, Amharas are saying it's ours. For me, what has to happen is a broader conversation, and not just between TPLF and the Amhara government, because because politics is so ethnicized that our leadership cannot make concessions, because somebody in Tigray would say TPLF is selling out, and somebody in Amhara would say exactly the same thing. And so we have to have a conversation, people to people, right, including the governments, but also a broader conversation, and that will, I think, lead to very creative solutions that can reduce the sense of ownership, because that is, I think, a lot of people don't understand that these boundaries have become hard. They're almost like countries, right? Especially because of the possibility of secession. And so because the boundaries have become hardened, we have to engage and loosen them. Once you loosen them, then where the areas belong will be less important, right? But as long as our sense of ownership that is prevalent in Ethiopia now continues, the boundaries will continue to be contested, will continue to be lead to violence unless they are negotiated. And so my hope is, and then quite frankly, it's embarrassing, especially for Tigray and Amhara elites, who at least at face value have the most senior political leaders. Like if you look at Ethiopian politics, Amharas and Tigrayans, the TPLF and the Amhara leadership are where the old guard is still dominant, right? In Oromia, it's a new force. In Somalia region, it's a new force, but in Amhara and in Tigray, it's really the old guard, the most senior. These are supposed to be the wise ones. It's really embarrassing for both Amhara and Tagaru that we have not been able to say, look, this is a problem. Let's sort it. Because I think once that hard age of ownership goes away, the possibilities for a settlement, an acceptable settlement, will increase. And quite frankly, I think these contested areas have been like a blinding glass for both Amhara and Tagaru, that have undermined their focus where the bigger issues are, which is at the center. So Amharas are kind of stuck there, and you have a threat from Tigray, and therefore the central government can actually use that to play you, right? They can keep you silent, and the same with Tigray, right? And so it's quite frankly embarrassing for the most senior politicians in the country that are supposed to be in Amhara and Tigray, that they have to rely on the federal government to even talk. I mean, it's really absurd, Taklai, if you think about it. And I'm not even talking about the fact that these are regions that have lived together, in terms of religion, in terms of language, in terms of culture, in terms of the sense of pride and all, are very, very, very similar. And sometimes, there is this expression from Sigmund Freud, who talks about the narcissism of small differences. And sometimes that just explains what is happening between Tigray and Amhara. But otherwise, quite frankly, they are solvable. These problems are solvable, but they can all be solved if we see them as a people-to-people issue and engage beyond the government. But that requires talking directly without any intermediaries, particularly the federal government, because it has an interest, right? Even if we assume good intentions, the national government has an interest in exploiting some of these contestations to its advantage. Even if we assume they have the best of intentions, right? And so, again, I like to summarize it. The threat comes because the problem has not been sorted, right? And I think a lot of Amharas, if you ask them about people that were in the area returning, they would say, of course they can return, but they can only return if the threat is away. It goes away, because as long as the tension is there, bringing them back means you are increasing the possibility of an internal fight, right? And so it's basically they're intertwined, finding a political solution to the issues and ensuring that people that were there, whose properties, whose land was taken, they have to be back, and they have to be, they have to return and resettle. But I really hope, and I don't know, hopefully the audience will hear that. It's embarrassing, quite frankly, that for the most senior political elites from two communities that have historically lived together, need the intermediary of the federal government to talk to each other about this problem. It's really embarrassing.
Well, I think the point about the narcissism of small differences is a good one. I think this partly explains why it is such a heated issue. The actual issues on the ground are not as big as they are made out to be. I mean, it's true that there are hundreds of thousands of people who have been driven out. That there is, I mean, that is it's not. It's not something that you could dismiss as irrelevant. That's a big issue. But other than that, in terms of the talking points, they are not really that serious. But Adam, if you could dwell on this for a little while, not to be disputatious or anything, but I think it's, as you know, it's a very sensitive and thorny issue, and many people from Tigray and Amhara don't know how to have a discussion about this issue. So I think it's very important that you and me could do it, and people would be inspired by that. So one point in terms of Western Tigray and Raya, you say contested territories. I think the talking points from Tigray are well established. You will have read them countless times. That the current structure, the federation, was based on patterns of language, and that although Western Tigray, for instance, had been under Begemidir until 1991, it has been inhabited by majority Tigrayans. Historically, that Western Tigray is, whether it's by population or historically or by every other aspect, it has always been in Tigray. Those would be the point that Tigrayans would mention, even if if there is grounds to believe that it should have been demarcated in favor of the Amharas. There is a constitutional mechanism for doing that. That what the Amhara Special Forces and the Fano did 3 years ago, with the help of Eritrean forces, to go and to kill Tigrayans and to drive out hundreds of thousands of Tigrayans was morally wrong and unsustainable. Those will be the point that people from Tigray, and to a man, there is no difference between the TPLF, the other political parties, the Tigrayan elites, or the people who have been driven out from Western Tigray. It's the same points, literally. So I think that the point that I don't hear addressed from the Amhara elite side is that even on their terms, I'm forgetting the arguments and the validity of what they say, even accepting the concern that they raise, which is that Western Tigray should be under Amhara. Even if you were to accept that, the way that they went about it, with the help of a foreign force who had an agenda. But I mean, I think it's clear what the Eritrean troops were trying to achieve in Tigray. To do that, to go into Western Tigray instead of protecting your fellow countrymen, and to believe that you could actually sustain that for a long time, or to believe that that could be a foundation for Ethiopia after you have committed ethnic cleansing, it's just wrong by all accounts. I think that is the point that I don't see people from the Amhara side properly engaging.
Yeah, I think you're right. There are certain things that I think are undeniable, and I think Amharas will recognize that hundreds of thousands of Tagaro have been displaced, and a lot of them have been killed as part of the conflict, but also after the areas were militarily under Amhara federal and under Amhara and federal forces. I don't think a lot of people will deny that. What they deny is that they don't want that to be the only focus. So they will tell you, for instance, you're talking about the areas being historic, at that particular time being occupied mainly by Tagaro and all. And then they will tell you, for instance, in Benishangul Gumuz, there are more Amharas than other groups there, right, in the region. But because the area is seen as historically, right, so it's not just the number of people there, but it's seen historically as belonging to the people, the particular tribes, groups there, right? And so you have a sort of a contradiction, right? So it's not just the number of people that matters, but something else, right? Like a historical claim, rather than just whether there are Amharas or Tagaro or not. I am saying this basically to indicate that it's complicated.
Adam, if I could interject, I think the point about, or the grievance about the need for Amharas, whether they live in Tigray or in Benishangul Gumuz or in Oromia, for them to be recognized and to have proper rights in whatever form it might come. We can have a discussion. I think that's a perfectly valid grievance that the Amharas have. There is no doubt in my mind about that.
Yes. Yes, indeed. I think that's where in areas where there's no contestation, there should be sufficient protection, sufficient representation. Essentially, there should not be political marginalization. And where there is political marginalization, it leads to economic marginalization and all kinds of consequences. But to go back to the point before, so the areas have become now, as I said, there were always questions, right? But the Amhara government at that particular time was focused on saying, yes, we have a claim, but we want to use an internal self-determination mechanism within Tigray to give the Amharas living their rights and protection and all of that. That was the discourse at that particular time. That has changed. And that's what I was trying to say. Unless this thing is settled properly through negotiations, whenever you have a new force, whenever you have a new political group, they will make different claims, right? And that's why I said this has to be settled people with people and not just with the governments, because we cannot assume that the TPLF will always be there. So that if the TPLF is the only one agreeing to this thing, rather than a genuinely inclusive Tigrayan public, and the same on the Amhara side, the demands will change. The historical claims will change. And you can always generate evidence to support these things, because it's very difficult. Historical movement of people, not just within Ethiopia, but across the world, it's very, very difficult. It's very difficult to pin it, right? And so, especially, as I say, once the politics became ethnic-centered, and once the ethnic groups started making claims, not just random claims, but ownership claims, that then kind of, and I don't know, ownership often is determined not by what you do, but what you make others not do, right? It's about exclusion rather than, and so that if you say this is mine, it belongs to me, that basically means others cannot come in, or they come in under my conditions, right? And so point I'm trying to make is that if the areas, the boundaries and all were settled, and then the issue of minority protection, getting identity groups in any area, the privilege they require, the representation and all becomes easier. But first, the boundaries either have to be settled, or the idea of boundaries have to be reconceptualized. Until we have achieved that, they will prove contested. Because, as I said, one, there was no negotiation in the first place to determine these things, and two, historically, I'm not a historian, but I have the sense to believe that people move in different directions at different times, and it's very difficult to pinpoint. We have to start from this particular time, because if you go 10, 20, or even 200 years back, things may look very different. It's a very difficult thing to show, and so. Ideally, for me, what we should do is reduce the value of these boundaries, because, as I said, at the moment, I mean, sometimes, like if you think about what the contestation between Amhara and Tigray, you will not imagine it in other places between countries, because they have made it less relevant. People can move easily, people can settle easily, and politically, whether you are on this side or on that side of the border, your rights are seen. Just like the European Union. Right, you can reduce, you can make boundaries less hard, even across countries and not just within countries. And so, and that's what I'm trying to say. I think we, Amharas and Tigrays in particular, but across the country, because as I said, the boundary disputes are not, it's just the most violent that we have seen. But actually, the boundary dispute between Oromia and Somalia was equally violent, between Afar and Somalia, also equally violent. And a lot of hundreds of thousands have been displaced, and all of this would have to be sorted either by reconceptualizing the idea of boundaries, so that regardless of which side of the boundary you live, you will get, almost the same rights, the same freedom, or if we want to maintain the current hard sense of boundaries, it would have to be negotiated. and negotiated not just between the ruling parties, but by people to avoid a repeat cyclic conflict every 20, every 30 years.
It's interesting, Adam, that you say one way forward is to make the boundaries less conspicuous. And I think until the war, until 2022, from my experience, again, it was as easy to go from Adwa to Gondar as it was to Humara or to Adga. So actually, the boundaries were dissipating until the war came, and all of a sudden, people became transient. And again, I'm being honest with you, I would put the blame on the Amhara forces, on the Eritrean forces, if I'm being honest, because what they did for me is completely beyond the pale. Again, you could have 1,000 criticisms of the TPLF, of the way how it handled its relations with Abiy Ahmed, that they should have been more diplomatic, that they should have been less hawkish in the propaganda in the days and months leading up to the war. So I have as much criticism of the TPLF as anybody else. But what subsequently happened in terms of Western Tigray, in terms of the eviction of people, the killing of people, I would put not just the weight of blame, but actually in its entirety on those forces. So that is how the boundary now became more visible, and it became part of people's consciousness now. But otherwise, it was something that was on the wane.
I think. So I want to push back a bit, Teklai, here, because before the war already, the Colonel Demek, I mean, I didn't know this guy before. He became a prominent name suddenly because we started hearing that they were charged with terrorism. And when you start inquiring, you realize that they were not allowed. At least that was the discourse, and it's probably it's more nuanced than this is. But the thinking at the time was there was a deliberate attempt to reduce, to basically reduce speaking Amharic, providing services in Amharic and schools, and also it made a difference whether you are on this side or on the other side of the. It was, I think.
I find, again, not to make it too endful, but I find that very, very, as a comment, very dishonest, because forget Humara or Raya, even in Maqala, you would think you were in Bahardar, like people speak Amharic. So the idea that the TPLF or the Tigray government was trying to reduce Amharic in Western Tigray, it's just something that would never happen.
Well, I mean, again, I'm not from that area. But I will not completely, I think people will not raise arms, will not fight, especially a dominant force, for nothing. And you're right, I mean, in Mekelle and all, but there's a difference between speaking Amharic and taking it out of the educational, the administrative system, right? And that's very different. And I think even now, just like you said, if the boundaries were to return, all these issues would have to be addressed, right? But they were not addressed before. That schools would have to be in Amharic, the Amharas there in the region will have political representation. All of these things did not exist before the war. That's one. And secondly, you are right. I think there's no justification for what was done in those areas, for the displacement, for the killing. There's no justification. And this is very important. But it also happened in the context of war, right? Because I don't want to appear like I'm justifying what was done, right? But it happened. There was a context to within which this thing happened, and especially, I don't know if you remember, at the beginning of the war, the first atrocity. Of course, there was a lot of propaganda and all, but the first atrocity that was recorded was in Maikadra. I don't know if you remember. That was the first thing that So when you have armed groups that have been told that you have been discriminated and they have been trying to.
Just one caveat, Adam. There is the way the atrocity in Maikadra unfolded is not as has been reported by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. I think the more realistic report was given by Reuters. And it's true that Tigray forces did commit atrocities, but so did Amhara forces. And it's more complicated than, although what happened was because the again, I don't want to go into other areas, but one of the things that the Israeli government said when the Hamas committed atrocity was that the Hamas deliberately murdered children, when in fact that wasn't what happened, but because by saying that, you make it easy for people to believe that Hamas is more cruel than it actually is. And the Ethiopian regime also wanted to say that the Tigray forces were uniquely evil, and it was them who committed atrocities. So it was a simplified version that was presented to the Ethiopian people. But actually, what actually transpired is more nuanced than that. I just wanted to add that. But otherwise, you're right.
I believe you, Taklai, and that's why I was saying there was a lot of, whenever there's a context, there's I don't know who said it, but the first casualty in war is the truth. Everything becomes propaganda. But even though it was exaggerated, it's a fact that a lot of people were killed in my cadre by the Tigrayan forces. And so what I'm trying to do, again, I'm not trying to justify what was done, right? There is no justification for it, but there was the context within which this thing happened. And I think, I can try and be a saint and say, they are evil, they shouldn't do it and all, but what was done before affects how people react. But there was already, before all of this started, there was a lot of anger, right? There was a sense of revenge, a desire for revenge, and a sense that, the TPLF has been governing the country, and then suddenly now they want to fight and control us again. There was a lot of anger at that. And then you hear about what happened in Maikadra. And then you have that historical grievance, whether true or exaggerated. There's a lot of reports, and again, it may be exaggerated, but a lot of Amharas from the areas have been displaced or prevented from returning, and all of that has been happening. So essentially, what I'm trying to say is that, as unjustifiable as it is, there was a context of war which makes things more complicated. Now, all of that would have to be addressed. I think this has to be recognized, and that's where the reconciliation, the people-to-people engagement comes. People will have to return to their places. All of these things have to be recognized and rectified on all sides, and all of that. And so, again, and I don't know, because the worst thing I would do is to justify violence. I don't, but it's important to understand it, right? Understanding something is not necessarily justifying it. And in that sense, I think, if we have a longer period of time, you will understand the anger, you will understand the violence. Whether this was propaganda, whether this was exaggerated to create the conditions, as you said, for this kind of violence, at least to make yourself feel better for what you're doing, it's debatable. But it's clear that the violence occurred, but it's also clear that it happened within a particular context. And all of that would have to be considered. And in terms of how do you address it? Again, it's very difficult because there's a lot of anger, because there's the pettiness, because of the narcissism of the small differences. But if we can draw the courage really across lines, and that's why when Getachew Reda was in Bahar Dar, I think in June last year, I really had a lot of hope. I had a lot of hope because I thought, you just need a small gesture to ease the tension. And then I thought that will then lead to direct talks to find solutions. And that hasn't happened. And unfortunately, it seems like things are escalating again, which will only make it worse, because wherever there's an escalation, there's violence. And then that then justifies the next round of violence. I really hope, and I think, if I can urge you again, is that in Tigray, there is a sense that the war was not fair, right? The war was not fair, and it wasn't fair for the people of Tigray. And a lot of damage has been done. And that because it was not fair, at a minimum, things should go back to where they were. But that's a thinking, right? Because we are the victims, and now we are being asked to give up land. That's a thinking, which is absolutely understandable. But at the same time, it may not always lead to a productive resolution, because that thinking means then you become absolute, right? That it's mine or, or what, I don't know. So what I urge people in Tigray, but also in Amhara, is to say, look, yes, we've committed atrocities on these issues in the past years, but we have to also recognize that it is a consequence. The problem is a consequence of the way the politics is structured. As I said, the sense that this is my border, and then if you are there, it's really, you're saying that the boundaries were dissipating, but I don't think so. I think across the country, they were actually hardening the boundaries. And unless a solution is found to that idea that we live in the same country, that even if we are on either side of the border, we'll have similar or comparable rights, we will not solve it.
I think it's good that you raised context, that there was context to everything that happened, but also I think I fear saying, there was context behind everything, sort of minimizes the degree of what happened. I think there was something uniquely evil to what happened in Tigray, not just what happened actually, but also the things that were being said on TV by government officials and all that. And again, if I could give you just one counterfactual to sort of show you my thought process. If, for instance, the mainstream thinking in Amhara circles in 2020, when it was very clear that Abiy and Isaias were planning to invade Tigray, if the mainstream thinking then in Amhara circles was to say, well, we have a problem with the TPLF, we have problem, for instance, of Western Tigray, we believe that Western Tigray should belong to the Amharas, we have all these issues, but we're not going to use an opportunity with foreign powers, with Abiy Ahmed, to do what we believe should be done eventually. I think if that was the dominant thinking, I think both Amhara and Tigray would have been in a much more, comfortable position to have a discussion now. The sense of solidarity, but the sense of brotherhood wouldn't have been torn apart.
I agree. And actually, I don't know if you are, I'm sure you have a better, technologically more savvy than I am. If you look at my Twitter posts at that particular time, that's exactly what I was saying, that the Amharas have to stop Abiy. That's what I was saying around just before November 4, that unfaithful night, and after. The first thing I was saying was, you're right, you have a lot of points to score with the TPLF, but going to war is the worst choice. It doesn't help the region. So even if Tigray is the TPLF force were contained in the region, because you are on the border, you are going to suffer, right? And that's what happened to Amhara. Even if the war ultimately it ended in the region, but even if it doesn't get to your region, the burden is on you, because you are close. You are essentially to feed the army. You have to provide medical service to the army. Everything. It's a massive burden, and it doesn't solve it, because it makes you even more vulnerable, because now there's a weak point. That it becomes a vulnerable point, that area. And so those in the center can easily take advantage of it. So I don't know if you can, but you can go and check it. At that particular time, I was saying the Amhara government should stop it. But at the time, I was against the current, because there was a lot of anger, as I said, because the thinking in Amhara was not what you said. The thinking was not that Eritrea and the federal government were going to invade Tigray. The thinking was, the TPLF is not willing to give in, is not willing to accept the new reality, and wants to continue its dominance. That was the thinking, right? And the thinking also was, and again, we can go back and fight and all, but sometimes it just doesn't matter. But the thinking, the perception is that the TPLF started this thing. So everything was defensive. That's the thinking. But again, for me, you're right, and that's part of my anger, actually, at the Amhara leadership, because they seem to be extremely reactive, extremely unstrategic, right? They want to jump into the problem they face, rather than thinking broadly in terms of how that affects the strategic interest of the region and the strategic interest of the country. But at the same time, I think also I sometimes feel like they have wanted the war, because it kind of gave them an opportunity to blame it all on the TPLF, right? So we're like, we're going to wash our hands, even though they were the ones doing most of the damage in the region. You know, if people in Amhara were arrested, often it was because of the Amhara government itself, right? And so they used it as an opportunity to essentially transfer all the blame, all the guilt towards the TPLF. And in that sense, they had a strategic interest to support this war. But at the time, I was saying what you are saying now, that it was extremely, it was a strategic disaster, essentially, for the Amhara government at that time to support that war. They should have told Abiy, we don't want to go into this war. And I understand there were some who actually tried to do that within the government, and they have since been sidelined. My understanding is that, for instance, Gandu Andarakacho did not want it. And if you remember, the day after the war started, he was removed from his position and replaced. One of the main reasons for that was because he was against it. And I understand the former chief of staff of the army was the same. He didn't want it, and that's why he was removed the day after, because he was seen as sympathetic to a peaceful or long-term strategic resolution. But again, I think, unfortunately, Taklai, our elites, both in Tigray and in Amhara, have been making strategically disastrous mistakes for a very long time. They have been taking measures that did not make sense, or even, if they observe deeply, that did not make sense, and they are still doing that, unfortunately. And sometimes I think there's this idea of the fact, once you make a mistake, once you lie, you keep lying because that's the only way to cover the first lie. And it seems like they make a mistake and they keep making mistakes to justify the original mistake, which is very, very sad. And I think the Amhara government made a strategic mistake at that particular time. They keep making a similar mistake. And now, unfortunately, because the forces in Amhara, just like in Tigray, are more fragmented, there is fear. Like anyone that is seen as conciliatory would be seen as selling out. And quite frankly, if I was a Fano leader, the first thing I would do is I would say, I want to negotiate with Tigray. I want to talk with Tigray on these areas. I will not say this is our, no, the first thing I would say is I want to talk. That's what I would do. Because that will take a massive burden, a massive pressure, leverage point on other forces that are taking advantage of this, regardless of their intentions, right?
Yeah, well, in terms of strategic mistake, I think that's a good point. And one of the things that I don't hear many people talk about is how Fano has now undermined its position, because one of the things they say, and I think they have an element of truth when they say that, is that the Oromo PP is trying to one, demographically change Addis Ababa, and two, even muck around with the constitution to make Addis Ababa the capital city of sort of exclusively. But if you have by force occupied a land, regardless of the merit of the claim, if you have done that yourself, then you're not in a position to complain about what might happen in Addis Ababa. So I think in that sense as well, they have undermined their position. So it's a strategic mistake, also for Tigray, because now they are completely occupied by those issues which are at the end of the day completely useless, and bigger things are happening around them, but they have lost the forest for the trees, as they say. So it's a strategic mistake.
Both Tigray and Amhara, and I don't mean just governments, whether you call it Fano or opposition in Tigray, everyone, sadly, it's like they have been blindfolded by the land contestation. And as you said, I think one of the characteristics of our politics is that what you say, that everybody is shooting themselves in the foot. Right? There's no consistency. There's no strategic thinking in terms of deeply, like the tendency is to think fast and act slow, rather than the opposite, to think very, very slow and act fast. Or perhaps more, both think fast and act fast. That's a tendency. But in reality, you have to really think slow and act fast. So to that extent, you're right. It's really a characteristic, particularly of the politics in Tigray and Amhara, that we'll be shooting ourselves in the foot.
Mm. Yeah, I think if you could zoom out of the Tigray-Amhara issue, because I mean we could go on endlessly, a lot of stuff to talk about. But if we could focus for a moment on the bigger picture in terms of Ethiopia, what it is that politicians, whether that is in Tigray and in Amhara, in Oromia, and generally Ethiopia, what it is that they should do? I know that in the piece you propose first in Amhara the formation of a grassroots-based popular government to represent Amhara in negotiations, and that we take things from there. Maybe I'm putting words in your mouth. You correct me, but what do you think should be done?
Well, I mean, for me, the first thing is to accept that there's a legitimacy crisis at the Ethiopian level, but also at the regional level. In a way, it's a legitimacy crisis at the regional level that is creating the legitimacy crisis at the national level. That has to be recognized. Of course, the government at the moment, just like what they were saying during the war between the Tigray and the Ethiopian government, is that we're not going to negotiate. We are a legitimate government. We cannot recognize these other people, because they're not legitimate. And I always say we were elected, right? But as you know, our elections, even in the best of circumstances, cannot provide exclusive legitimacy, right? And so there is a legitimacy crisis. And the Ethiopian government, especially in the center, is using that. They just basically they're playing the same thing. The Amhara government say, well, if you have problems, wait 2 years. We'll have another election, and then it will be sorted. But essentially, like, oh, we're going to have elections, right? They're going to solve everything. No, the contestation is a question of legitimacy, and that is about elections, but it's more than that. Right? And the elections would have to be free and fair and credible. But even when they are free and fair and credible, they don't solve the problem, because some of the challenges are beyond elections. For me, the best metaphor is like football, right? Football is the game, right? So elections are like, you play and then you say, yeah, this one has won, that one has lost, and then you go. But what we don't know is all the rules that are necessary for the football game to happen, like the size of the pitch, the shape of the pitch. Like a football pitch is not round, right? It's rectangular, right? And it's part of it. Like there has to be rules around. Okay, how do you set up the teams? Is it based on age? Is it based on gender? How do you do those things? And in Ethiopia, all these background rules, like what should Ethiopia be like? Should we be federal? If we're federal, should it be ethnic? If it's ethnic, how do you draw the boundaries? All of these issues. And most importantly, how do we share power in the center, right? At the moment, it's a big issue now. The tendency to think about the regions, but for me, the main issue is in the center, because in particular now, the Tigray kind of has retreated. They are not in the center anymore. Amharas feel like they are being made like permanent junior partners, and other regions as well. There's a sense that there's an Oromo dominance now, and especially in Amhara, you say, well, look, the prime minister, political head is Amhara, the security head is chief of staff is Amhara, Oromo, and then you have Addis Ababa, which is bigger than any ministry you can imagine, is also Oromo. So they tell you, look, there's dominance, and at best, what they want is Amharas to be second. The second play to play second fiddle. So what I'm trying to say is that we have to agree in terms of how power is going to be shaped at the center. And we haven't done that. And so if you dig deeper, for me, if the Amharas were not displaced from other places, if the Amharas felt that the central government was fair, that they feel represented in the center, I don't think like issues in Walqaid and Tagade and all would have happened. It's really driven by the center. And especially in the Ethiopian context, where historically and today the center is the kingmaker, right? So while the boundaries, conflicts, while the regional power and all of that is important, the more fundamental power is how do we establish a legitimate government in the center, And how do we make that government equitable and inclusive? Equitable in the sense that everybody sees themselves, maybe not every time, but over time. Like over 15 years, everybody must say, look, it's my government, that I was a prime minister at this time and all. So not everybody can be a prime minister at one time, but over a long time, everybody must see themselves in the center, right? And that requires negotiation there. And as you know, there's supposed to be a National Dialogue Commission, and they are doing quite a good job, I think. But they have been overtaken by events. Things are a lot more serious. It's like it's above their pay grade now. The negotiations have happened at the elite level, and then that will complement the public consultations and all that the National Dialogue Commission is conducting. So in effect, you have Tigray, you have Amhara, you can look at these problems in isolation, but ultimately, the problem is about the center. How do we establish a legitimate country, a legitimate state structure, a legitimate government, but also how do we make it inclusive and equitable? So, even if it is inclusive, like the Prosperity Party will tell you that, look, we have Somalis, we have Amharas, we have Tagaru in our government. We are inclusive, they will tell you. But it's not seen as legitimate because the Tagaru and the Amharas think that the Amharas there or the Tagaru there are not their representatives. They don't represent them effectively. You see, and so it has to be seen as equitable and not just inclusive. And so it has to be equitable, it has to be inclusive, and it has to be legitimate overall. And that, of course, requires credible elections, but it requires a lot more than that. And so, in effect, for me, that may be, let me put it this way, there are two things that must happen for me. They may not be sufficient, but they are necessary, right? Even if these two things happen, we may not have a solution, but I don't think we'll have a solution without these two things. One is that each group must talk within itself. Like Tagaru must sit together and say, what is the Tigrayan strategic interest? What do we want as Tagaru? And then that has to be accepted by a sufficient majority of Tigrayan forces. Because otherwise, it would be like, one would be presented as more Tagaru than another, right? And so, and then the same thing has to happen within Amhara. The Amhara forces have to sit together and say, what is the strategic Amhara interest that, regardless of who is in government, will protect, right? So we can disagree on policy issues, on this, on that, but what is the strategic Amhara interest and how can we advance it? At the regional level, at the same thing in Oromia, that has to happen. Because I think the main driver of problems between groups is actually a lack of conversation within each group. Because each group, there is a subgroup within each group that tries to outbid the other one, to be more Amhara or more Tagar or more Oromo than the other. And we need to solve that. And so, it's very difficult to produce consensus, but at least there must be sufficient consensus so that there will be a stable engagement on those issues. That's one. And the second level is the higher level, like between groups, but also between groups in the sense of ethnic groups, but also ideological groups, right? And that has to happen at the center to make sure that it's legitimate, to make sure that it's equitable, to make sure that it is inclusive. And as I say, the National Dialogue Commission is doing a good job, but the issues are now especially above its pay grade. And so it can conduct the consultations that it's doing, it can talk to people and bring in the popular input to shape the conversations, the elite level conversations around what is a legitimate government, around how power should circulate, because I don't want to talk about sharing power. I want to talk about circulating power so that everybody over a period of time will see themselves in the center and not just in their region. So I think these two things have to happen. And without them, I am afraid it would be, we'll be muddling through. And unfortunately, and this is the government, particularly in Addis Ababa, seems to be doing, basically to just have abandoned the idea of engagement and saying, okay, we cannot talk, we just want to do. And then we're going to change Addis Ababa, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And so we're just going to focus on doing, because all this negotiation is just too hard to get to. That's the thinking. But ultimately, without that, as we saw what happened in Tigray, what is happening in Amhara, and what happened in Sudan, in Khartoum and all, there is no oasis. Even Addis Ababa, as much as I don't want it, it's very, very difficult for it to remain an oasis of peace and of infrastructure and all. So these are the fundamental issues. And quite frankly, I think what the country needs now is not a beautiful city. It's a beautiful system. And that cannot be built without negotiation. And once the system is built, maybe this is the Ethiopian exceptionalism coming now, but I think as a country, we can develop extremely fast. It's a country with tremendous potential. If we can sort the fundamental problems, it is a country with extremely, extremely high potential. And so what we see, the same thing, what happened during the EPRDF years under the TPLF, what happened now as well, with all the war and all, it's amazing what Ethiopians can do and have done. And so once we sort the system, and I think I wish that the government and Abiy and all will focus on that legacy, on creating a legacy of creating a system, rather than a legacy of a beautiful park or a beautiful lodge or a beautiful street in Addis Ababa. All of that anybody can do. Anybody with good project management skills and with the budget can do. But creating the system and will essentially lay the background, the springboard for an unstoppable Ethiopia.
So one of the issues that I always think about and that I find interesting is that but elites, people who write, people who form opinions, and people like you in the ideas space are failing to be brutally honest. That is one of the problems that I sense. And for instance, for anybody who has been paying attention to Ethiopian politics and to Abiy Ahmed, it is abundantly clear that Abiy Ahmed is not someone that, again, in my opinion, someone that would play a positive, constructive role in solving the problems Ethiopia has. It's a problem. He's incapable. He's a fraud. I must say again. I'm not asking that you agree with my description. And I would have thought that the first thing to do for anybody who sets out to write and to inform would be to make that very, very, very clear. This is a man who is a problem. He can't be part of the solution. But you don't do that in the piece. And you generally go soft on him. Again, I say you, but generally it's something that is a common characteristic among Ethiopian writers and all that. Why is that? Why is that?
Well, I mean, I have, it's very interesting because there was a moment. Let me start with the general one. I think you're right. Abiy is in government. He has his ideas. And we can talk about his capacity and all, but it's hard. But what I see is that he is there and he sees himself as legitimate, and therefore he will not do anything unless he's pushed to do, right? And so the burden is not on him, but on the opposition, on the people with alternative ideas to coalesce. To stand together on the important things rather than battling it out on the small things and just dividing themselves up as cancer cells. There is a need to stand together, leverage, and put pressure on the government. That's the only way. So we cannot expect the government to change itself. At least we have to put pressure on it to change itself. That's one thing. And so whether we like him or not, the only way I think for the government to change its course, to get to what we think is the right way, is to organize ourselves, to overcome some of the petty differences and focus on the bigger issues, and create a coalition, a strong, powerful coalition that then puts pressure on the government to come to terms with the popular demand. So that's one. And two is that I think, I don't think that if we magically withdraw Abiy Ahmed today, Ethiopia will be fine. I don't think that will happen. I think we tend to think in heroes and heroes.
What I mean, again, Adam, what I mean by that, just to elaborate, so that you have a correct sort of understanding of my premise. So, for instance, you say that the National Dialogue Commission has been doing a good job. It's just that things have become beyond their capability. But to me, for instance, it's clear that the commission was a gimmick that Abiy set up to pretend that he was interested in national commission, because otherwise the commission has been rejected by all major opposition parties in Ethiopia, by the TPLF, by the OLF, and there is no way that any honest person should think that the commission was intended to legitimately engage Ethiopians in a dialogue or discussion. It was part of Abiy's game to create the facade that he was trying to solve the problems for his Western donors and for other people who are, creating pressure on Abiy to do one thing or another, and also to hoodwink Ethiopians into thinking that he's interested in dialogue and commission. Otherwise, there is no way that anybody should believe the commission would do a serious job. But when someone like you who has, who knows everything that's happened, who has legitimacy among many readers, when you say that the commission is trying to do its best, when in fact the very reason it was founded, it was set up, was to help Abiy, are you not creating a problem? That's what I want to say.
Yeah, well, I'll come back to this, but I think let me finish the first point. I'll come back to this. So the point I'm trying to make is that one is that the government can change only if there is a counter force that is as strong, and that requires a coalition, because governments, they have the advantage of the state. They are incumbents. So they can only be counteracted by a coalition of all important forces that must overcome their petty differences and organize around the key issues, right? Like democracy and rule of law. Because if you don't have this, regardless of whatever policies you have, you cannot implement it, right? And so you must first establish, the coalition must first and foremost focus on building these things, a good system. That's one. And so in that sense, I think making it about Abiy is less productive. That's one. And two, in terms of what I think, I mean, actually, there was a long time, for a long time, I was actually, it's very interesting because of when the Tigray war happened, until the Tigrayan forces crossed the Amhara region into Amhara and Afar regions, I was seen as a TPLF supporter, and that I was anti-Abiy. That's how I was seen as. I often had to defend myself, and I said, to the minimum, I said, how can you rely on a single person? Even if he was, even if he was benevolent, even if he was God sent, how can a country rely on a single person, right? Assuming that he's flawless and all. That's what I used to say. But then the war shifted, and I started to be extremely critical of the TPLF, because for me they should have stayed and at least given a chance for genuine negotiation, rather than saying the war has ended, there's nobody to talk to. And
well, wasn't that naive, Adam? I mean, it was clear that Abiy was going to lay a siege. I mean, there is no way that he should have believed, if they had stayed in Tigray, Abiy would have been interested in negotiating. I think they had to force him into. It's a point that you yourself made. Abiy could do one thing or another only if he's cornered into doing that. But it wasn't that obvious to you.
At that particular point, at least, I think the TPLF. It was the second, they had won at that particular time. For me, they had won. They were just impatient and angry, I think. Impatient because they thought they had an advantage in the conflict that they could go ahead. But also angry that, they felt like they were, bombed, and as a people, there was a sense that they were humiliated, and so they had to return it, right? But at that particular time, I thought they had won it.
Again, but Adam, I think they entered. So just to set the record straight for you to reflect on, they entered Maqala on the 28th of June, and they waited patiently until September. And in that interim time, nothing happened. There was no aid getting into Tigray. The inflammatory rhetoric from Addis Ababa continued. The preparations continued. So there was reason for them to grow impatient. I just want to put that out there.
Yeah, because I think, I don't want to be drawn back, because we've talked about it, about this decline. But the point I'm trying to make, but you're right that, that there is need for pressure on Abiy. And that's the only way. And the second point you made about the National Dialogue Commission, you're right. I have written about it, actually. I said the biggest challenge for the commission was it has a birth defect. And I've said it in Addis Ababa long before this thing started. It has a birth defect. And birth defects, as you know, they're not your fault. Right? If I have if I come out with one arm, it's not my fault. Right? And so the commission then has a burden. Even if I don't have one arm, then I have to make do, right? I have to find a solution, even if it's not my fault. And the commission should have done that, and they didn't do that. They didn't do that enough. One and two, I am a firm believer that boycotts don't help; they don't work. I wish we can talk for very long. And recently, two things happened in Africa. One is in Senegal, another one in Togo. In Senegal, the opposition were angry. The incumbent tried to do anything to stay in power. But the opposition kept fighting, but they never said they will boycott the elections. Never, because if they had done that, it would have been a wedding. It would have been an epiphany for the government. They would have organized it, win the election, and say we are the government. But they didn't, and they won it in the end. In Togo, in 2020, I think, the opposition said we don't like this government. We're not going to participate in the elections. And what happened? The government won all the parliamentary seats. And what did they do? The parliament now, a few weeks ago, what did they do? Because they are all government, they adopted a constitutional amendment. And now the president is going to be basically a president for life. If the opposition had run, even under pressure, they probably would have won some seats to stop this. Essentially, I think boycott, is, for me, it's a defeatist strategy. You're right that participating in something will legitimize it. But I think the cost of not participating is worse than the cost of legitimizing the process by participating in it. So I'm a firm believer in that. And quite frankly, I have never seen boycott as a strategy, as a functioning, effective strategy. And so engagement would have been better. And I think it still is better. But as I said, there are issues that the National Dialogue Commission cannot address. Like how, what should be how should the center be organized? Because I think my biggest fear, I'll be frank with you, that the government, it's almost ideological that we don't want to talk to elites, we want to talk to people. Basically, they want to bypass sensitive elite level conversations by engaging the public, which is extremely counterproductive, because it's not going to work. One, often the public doesn't understand some of these, especially the institutional aspects. For the public, it's about governance, it's about education, it's about delivery of service, it's about governance, it's about bread and butter issues. Institutional aspects, how should the country should be, and all of that is about elites, right? And on those issues, the public often looks for cues from elites that it sees as representing them, right? And so I'm afraid that the government and the Dialogue Commission itself has created this almost utopian idea that their job is to talk to people, not to elites, which is not going to work. And the TPLF has done that. The EPRDF has done that, by the way. They always basically ignored elites, and they always said our constituency is the peasantry, so we're going to talk to them. But you cannot bypass that. It just doesn't work. And so, and unfortunately, I think the way it is designed, the National Dialogue Commission is not designed to enable that high-level conversation. And for that, and I don't know if there was an article I wrote for Al Jazeera, I think about two and a half years ago, saying that for the country to change, we need a genuine enabler. And I said, for a genuine enabler to emerge, it has to be the president and the prime minister. But the prime minister can only be a genuine enabler if he promises to resign. I don't know if you've read it, but I said, I said, Abiy should promise to leave And that was because now it's too close, and maybe he will not accept it. Maybe he will not accept it anyway.
Yeah, but again, Adam, my criticism of you, or the issue I would take exception to would be that you should know Abiy, that sort of person. And when you make that point, you're not being honest. That would be what I would say.
No, but Tekla, I think there's two things that we often do. One is we censor ourselves thinking that this is not going to happen, that's not going to happen. We don't know that. We do not know that. I think we have to accept that we have no ability to see to the future. And so our job is to think what should happen, what will enable that result, and suggest it. Because if you tell yourself, "Oh, well, it will happen," because one, we don't know. I mean, quite frankly, we are not geniuses. We don't know what can happen and what cannot happen. And
I totally understand, but I think believing that Abiy might, come around to the conclusion that he's not the right person and therefore should make way for other people, I think is engaging in some fanciful thinking, because Abiy, he believes, he has this divine.
I do not know Abiy. But again, I do not know Abiy.
Fair enough.
Secondly, ideas have power, right? If, for instance, that coalition of the opposition, the alternative force emerged, for instance, this can be something they can ride on, right? But anyway, so I encourage you, Tekla, because the way I have come to think is that I do not want to censor myself by the idea that it's not possible, because quite frankly, I'm not good at judging what can happen and what cannot happen. I'm just not good at it. And I don't think anybody is good at it. That's one. And so in that, because I think we kind of detracted quite a lot. But the point I'm trying to make is that we should not think in evil and hero frames, right? Yes, Abiy Ahmed has, the thing is, I firmly believe, I want to give people the benefit of the doubt, right? I want to think that people can be mistaken rather than that they are evil. And maybe I'm wrong sometimes, but I think for the majority of people that I have experienced, that I have met, often the problem is that they think they are doing the right thing and they are not. So it's not that they want to do bad, but they think they are doing, they think. And as you know, people know what they are thinking, right? We don't know, but they know what they're thinking. And so when you start telling them you are evil, you're like, no, but I know I'm good. But you're calling me evil. And then they start to think you must be the evil one. You see? So I don't want to think in personal terms. I mean, as I said, I think I believe in agency. And I think somebody like Abiy, if he changes his thinking and say, I want to leave a legacy of different kind, and not of a beautiful Addis Ababa with parks and, rather than that, I want to leave a legacy that will create for the building of Addis Ababa 10 times over in 10 years across the country, right? And I think that's possible, especially with pressure. And so I don't like to think in absolutes. I was reading a really interesting article about the Chinese idea of yin and yang. I'm sure you know about it.
Yeah.
Essentially, the idea of that is that unlike the Christian thinking that there is evil, good must prevail or evil and all, this yin and yang idea is that they have to coexist. Light needs darkness, darkness needs light, evil needs good. What we need is to create a level of harmony, right? A level of harmony without thinking in absolute terms. Because I don't know, I want to say that in Amharic there's a saying, "Atakaro ibetasal." So takaro. And so basically, when you become an absolutist, when you become a fundamentalist, whether
don't push things to the limit, though. Yeah.
Exactly, and I don't think we should think in those ways. There is a context within which things happen, and I don't think we are often fair about those contexts. I don't think we judge individuals as if there's no context, as if they are acting in a vacuum, right? And if we're judged on that ground, I am evil. You, Paul, you become evil as well, right? The point I'm trying to make is that we should not believe in, or think in the frame of heroes and evils, but rather in creating coalitions, stronger forces and mechanisms to incentivize and enforce, if need be, actors like Abiy Ahmed to do the right thing. And so, yes, Abiy Ahmed, I think just like everybody should have a time limit, I don't think anybody should be there all the time. And that's why I said, if he has been there between 2018 and 2026, that's already 8 years, which is the term limit in South Africa and in Nigeria, after that, you cannot run anymore. And I thought, when I wrote it, there was about 4.5 or 4 years. And I thought that was a good time for him to look for a different kind of legacy. And unfortunately, we are not there, but that I think is the right way to still pursue. To not make it personal, to not say that you must leave, especially not leave now. That doesn't work. It's very, even you and I, if you tell me I have to leave my job now, it's very hard. And I only have three children and a wife to take care of, right? It's hard. And so we have to think of the context within which individuals act, with the constraints within which individuals act. And our first tendency, in my opinion, and maybe we should end it on that, our first tendency should be, how can we encourage, how can we recognize, how can we understand these people, but then engage them and make them change? And of course, we don't always succeed, but I think that often works much more often than the alternatives.
Oh, thank you very much, Adem. That was a fascinating conversation. I know you mentioned about your experience of studying other African countries like Senegal and Ghana, and also your experience with studying constitutions. And I would love us to have that conversation another time. But for today, thank you very much.
Taklai, again, thank you very much. I remember the first time we met, we were going at each other on Twitter, but in the end, we had a conversation. And we've kind of, at least now we have become cordial. And I think this is, we need to discover that. I think we need to be more curious. And I think aggression and violence, fundamentally, I think is a lack of curiosity. And we need to hopefully recover that, rediscover that. And I think you and I have done that, and hopefully others will do that. It was a real pleasure to talk to you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.